The courtroom fell quiet as Judge Samuel Thompson glared down at the young girl standing before him. Her name was Lily Collins, and though she appeared calm, there was a fire burning in her eyes. The tension in the room was palpable. No one had ever dared to interrupt the strict judge before. Yet that's exactly what Lily had done. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from today, and if you like these stories, don't forget to subscribe. With the courtroom filled with lawyers, reporters, and even the defendant's family, no one expected what would come next. The judge had just finished delivering a sharp reprimand to the defendant, a man accused of a terrible crime. Everyone in the room held their breath as Judge Thompson, with his cold and calculating tone, prepared to pass the sentence. He was the type of judge who never showed mercy, who followed the law with rigid precision, and no one had ever seen him waver, not in all his years on the bench. But then it happened. Lily, a 16-year-old girl with a heart full of passion and a mind full of questions, stood up in the middle of the judge's speech. She didn't care that the room was staring at her in shock. She didn't care that the judge was known for his authority and harsh punishments. She raised her hand, her voice trembling but determined. "Excuse me, Your Honor, but you're wrong." A gasp swept through the room. Everyone turned to look at Lily. Some people were too stunned to speak. Others couldn't believe what they were hearing. The judge, for the first time in his life, paused, his cold, unwavering gaze fixed on Lily, and for a moment, no one knew if he would explode with anger or if he would allow her to speak. Judge Thompson's voice was low, dangerous as he spoke. "What did you say, young lady? You have the audacity to interrupt me in my courtroom? Do you not understand the consequences of such behavior?" Lily stood tall, her heart racing but her spirit unbroken. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," she said, her voice louder now, "but the man you're about to sentence, he's not guilty. You don't understand. There's more to this story than what's been presented in court. Please let me explain." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Some were shocked, others confused. Lily had just accused a judge of being wrong in a courtroom, a place where authority was absolute. But the question remained. Was she telling the truth, or had she simply lost her mind? Judge Thompson's face turned a shade darker, his mouth tightening into a firm line. "This is highly inappropriate, young lady. You will remain silent. You will not speak again unless I say so." His words were thunderous, meant to silence her, but Lily wasn't done. She wasn't about to back down now, not when so much was at stake. "I know it's hard to believe, but I can prove it. Please give me a chance to show you," Lily pleaded, her eyes full of sincerity. The judge's fists clenched on the bench. He didn't tolerate interruptions, especially not from someone so young. The room held its breath as the tension thickened. Everyone could feel it. Something big was about to happen, something that no one had prepared for. And then, just when it seemed like Lily was about to be escorted out of the courtroom, something strange happened. Judge Thompson, his face still hard as stone, looked at her. His icy gaze seemed to soften for the briefest moment, as if a flicker of curiosity had finally broken through. But that brief look was enough to leave everyone in the room questioning what would happen next. The air was thick with uncertainty. No one moved. No one spoke. "Fine," the judge said, his voice cold but with a hint of something else beneath it. "You have 5 minutes. If you cannot convince me with whatever nonsense you're about to say, you'll regret ever speaking up." Lily's heart skipped a beat. This was her chance, her one and only shot. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for the biggest moment of her life. But what was she about to reveal that could possibly change everything? What truth was she so certain would shake the courtroom and even Judge Thompson to his core? Lily began to speak, and as she did, the room fell into a deadly silence. Her voice echoed with a quiet confidence, as she shared details no one had expected, details that would unravel everything they thought they knew. The words that left her mouth were shocking, unsettling, and they would leave the judge and everyone else questioning everything. But before Lily could finish, just as the tension reached its peak, the doors to the courtroom slammed open. A figure stepped into the room. Everyone froze. The judge's expression darkened. The newcomer's face was unmistakable. Lily's world came crashing down as the truth she had been fighting for suddenly shifted. What would happen next could change everything, and not in the way she had imagined. The figure who entered was a man in a dark suit, his presence commanding, drawing every eye in the room. The atmosphere, already heavy with tension, seemed to grow even more suffocating. The murmurs of the crowd stopped instantly as the man strode to the front of the room. His face was calm, almost too calm, but there was something about him that made everyone uneasy. Judge Samuel Thompson's eyes narrowed as he took in the man's entrance. He knew him well. This man, who now stood with quiet confidence before the bench, had been part of the case from the very beginning. Yet his sudden arrival seemed out of place, especially now when Lily was in the middle of her plea. Lily, still standing tall and trying to keep her composure, glanced at the newcomer. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Mr. Harrison Carter, the lead prosecutor in the case, the one person she had hoped would never show his face again. His arrival was no coincidence. She had known from the beginning that something wasn't right, but now her heart raced in fear. Mr. Carter's eyes briefly met Lily's, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned his attention to Judge Thompson, giving a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth and calculated. "I apologize for my sudden interruption. However, I believe it is imperative that we proceed with the sentencing. I have new information." Lily's mind raced as she pieced together the situation. Why was Carter here now? What new information could he possibly have? Her stomach twisted with dread. She knew he was no friend to the truth. For months, she had watched him manipulate the evidence, twist the words, and target the innocent man who was about to be sentenced. Judge Thompson, ever the embodiment of authority, looked up at Mr. Carter with a stern expression. "New information?" he repeated, his voice colder than ever. "You've had every opportunity to present your case, Carter. What could possibly be so urgent now?" Lily felt a pang of fear in her chest. The room, still in stunned silence, seemed to hold its collective breath. The prosecutor's reputation was that of a man who would do whatever it took to win. If he had new information, it wasn't something to be taken lightly. Mr. Carter cleared his throat, shifting his gaze toward Lily for a brief moment. She could have sworn she saw a flicker of something dark in his eyes, a look of disdain or perhaps even something more calculating. "I believe Miss Collins has just provided us with something worth considering," Mr. Carter said, his voice silky. "I'm afraid her proof, as she so confidently called it, is nothing more than a distraction. She is, as we all know, quite emotional. She's young, and though she may believe she's helping, her actions are only complicating matters." Lily's face flushed with anger. How dare he undermine her like that? She had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, but Carter's words made it seem as though she were some naive child who didn't understand the stakes. The room seemed to close in on her as she stood there, holding her ground. But before she could say another word, Judge Thompson raised a hand, signaling for silence. He turned to Carter, his expression unreadable. "I'm listening," the judge said curtly. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable as Mr. Carter stepped forward, holding up a small file in his hands. He opened it slowly, allowing everyone in the room to see the contents. It was a photograph, a clear, crisp image of the defendant, the man who was facing the charges Lily had been trying to clear. The photo showed the defendant standing with someone Lily had never expected to see. "It seems we have new evidence that changes the nature of this case," Carter said, his voice heavy with triumph. "This photograph was taken just days before the crime took place. As you can see, the defendant was seen with an individual who has strong ties to organized crime. This connection may be the key to understanding what truly happened." Lily's heart sank as she looked at the photo. It was undeniable. The man in the photograph was indeed the defendant. But who was the person standing next to him? Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the image, her mind racing. The figure beside him looked familiar, but she couldn't place it. Her instincts told her there was more to this picture than met the eye. But for now, all she could do was watch as Mr. Carter seized the moment. Judge Thompson's expression remained impassive as he examined the photograph. "This changes things," he said, his voice steely. "This could explain the motive behind the crime, Mr. Carter. I believe we need to take this into consideration." Lily's mind was spinning. She wanted to shout, to tell them all that they were being deceived. But something inside her told her to wait. She couldn't make her move too quickly. She had to be careful. If Carter had evidence like this, she needed to find a way to prove it was false before it was too late. Before she could gather her thoughts, the judge turned his attention back to Lily, his gaze sharp. "Miss Collins," he said, his voice as cold as ever, "you've had your chance, you've spoken your piece. Now it's time for the facts to speak for themselves." Lily swallowed hard but refused to back down. She knew the truth was out there, and she would find it. This photograph, whatever its true meaning, wasn't the end of the story. It was just another piece in a much larger puzzle. As the judge began to prepare for the next part of the proceedings, Lily felt a surge of determination rise within her. She couldn't let this moment slip by. She couldn't let Mr. Carter manipulate the truth. She had to act now. But just as she opened her mouth to speak again, something unexpected happened. The door to the courtroom creaked open once more. And this time it wasn't just one person who entered. It was a whole group. Lily froze, her eyes widening as she recognized the faces of people she never thought would be here. The room seemed to hold its breath once more as the group entered, each of them stepping with quiet confidence. They were not like anyone else in the courtroom. Their presence was almost eerie, as if they had been waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. And now that moment had arrived. The first person to step forward was a woman, tall and striking with dark hair that fell to her shoulders. She was dressed in an elegant black suit, and her eyes were sharp, scanning the room with a look of intense focus. Behind her, a man followed, wearing a long coat that seemed too dramatic for the occasion. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, giving him an aura of mystery. Judge Thompson's face grew even colder as he watched them enter. He knew them. Everyone in the room could feel the change in the air. The once calm and composed Judge Thompson was no longer in control. Something about these newcomers unsettled him. "Your Honor," the woman spoke, her voice smooth and controlled. "I trust we have not arrived too late." Lily's heart raced in her chest. She had no idea who these people were, but their entrance had thrown everything off balance. The woman's presence was commanding, and the man beside her gave off an aura of danger. They seemed like they were from another world, one that had nothing to do with the law, truth, or justice. Judge Thompson hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing at them before replying, "You are not expected here. This is a court of law, not a social gathering." "Who are you?" The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled coldly, as if she had been waiting for that very question. "We are here on behalf of the defendant," she said, her gaze briefly flicking to Lily. "I believe you'll find we have something very important to say." Lily's mind raced. The defendant? Was this some kind of trick? Who were these people and why were they involved? The room was filled with an air of uncertainty as everyone waited for the judge to respond. Judge Thompson seemed to be weighing his options for a moment. His usual stern demeanor faltered, but only for a brief second. His next words came out more slowly, as if he was considering each one carefully. "I will allow you to speak," he said. His voice still sharp but tinged with a rare uncertainty. "But make it quick. We have already wasted enough time." The woman stepped forward, her heels clicking on the marble floor with precision that made it clear she was used to being listened to. She took a deep breath and then began to speak, her words calm but dripping with something far more dangerous. "We have come to shed light on a truth that has been hidden from all of you," she began, her voice unwavering. "The case you were trying so hard to resolve is not as simple as it seems. The defendant, as you call him, is not who you think he is." Lily's stomach twisted with unease. What were they saying? Could this be the truth? Had the whole case been built on lies? "Your Honor," the woman continued, "I am afraid the information that has been presented thus far has been manipulated by none other than your trusted prosecutor, Mr. Harrison Carter." The statement hit like a thunderclap. Lily's eyes went wide. The woman's accusation was so bold, so dangerous, that it left everyone in the room frozen. Harrison Carter, the prosecutor who had fought so hard to convict the defendant, was now being accused of manipulating evidence. This was a game-changer, something no one could have predicted. Judge Thompson's jaw clenched. He turned to Carter, his expression unreadable. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Carter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood still, his face pale, his eyes flicking between the woman and the judge, his hands twitching slightly at his sides. The silence in the room was suffocating. Finally, Carter spoke, his voice strained. "This is absurd. There's no evidence to support such an accusation. I've been doing my job, presenting the facts as they are." His voice faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained control. "These people are trying to sabotage everything we've worked for." But the woman was not deterred. She smiled again, a smile that sent chills down Lily's spine. "We have evidence," the woman said simply, "and we are not afraid to present it. Evidence that shows Mr. Carter has been involved in manipulating key pieces of this case. Evidence that proves the defendant's innocence." The courtroom was in chaos. The room erupted into a frenzy of whispers as people exchanged shocked glances. Lily could hardly believe what she was hearing. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when everything would finally make sense, when the truth would come to light. But the questions only grew. Who were these people, and how had they uncovered such information? "I demand to see this evidence," Judge Thompson said, his voice now cold and authoritative. "If what you are saying is true, this will change everything." The woman nodded, and with a swift motion, she handed a folder to the judge. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the contents. For a few moments, there was nothing but the sound of pages turning. Then, the judge's eyes narrowed, and he looked up at Carter with an expression that was almost disappointed. "This is—" Judge Thompson's voice trailed off as he processed the documents in front of him. "This is highly troubling, Mr. Carter. I will need an explanation." Carter, now visibly shaken, struggled to maintain his composure. "Your Honor, this is a setup. They're trying to ruin me. This has nothing to do with the case at hand." "It's irrelevant," but the woman's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "We will see about that," she said, her tone cold and final. Lily couldn't believe it. The truth was finally coming to the surface, but it felt like the ground was shifting beneath her. Just as she thought the case was on the verge of unraveling, another figure stepped into the courtroom, blocking the door with an imposing presence. It was someone Lily never thought she would see again. The figure who entered the courtroom had everyone staring, their eyes wide in disbelief. It was a man Lily recognized immediately, someone who had been part of her life for many years. Yet she had never imagined seeing him here, in this moment, in this place. Detective Michael Rhodes, her father's old partner, stepped forward. His face was grave, his usual calm demeanor replaced with an urgent intensity. His entrance was not like the others who had walked in with quiet confidence. Rhodes seemed like a man who had just walked through a storm and was about to bring everyone into it. Lily's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen Detective Rhodes in months, not since her father's mysterious disappearance. It was as if he had fallen off the face of the earth, but now here he was, standing before them all like a ghost from the past. "Detective Rhodes," Judge Thompson said, his tone less sharp than usual. "What is the meaning of this? You have no business here." The detective didn't flinch at the judge's harsh tone. He simply stood tall, his eyes scanning the room. Lily could see the years of experience etched on his face. He was not the type of man to back down, and something told her that whatever he had to say would change everything. "I believe I have every right to be here, Your Honor," Rhodes said, his voice steady and calm. "Especially after what I've uncovered." The room was silent once again, the atmosphere thick with tension. Lily could feel her pulse racing as she tried to understand what was happening. Why was Rhodes here? What was he about to reveal? The detective moved forward, and the woman who had accused Carter of manipulating evidence stepped aside, allowing him space to speak. Rhodes didn't waste any time. "I'm here because the truth you all think you know isn't the truth at all," he said, his eyes locking with Lily for just a moment. She felt a shiver run down her spine. The way he looked at her, as though he understood something she didn't, was unsettling. But she couldn't look away. She needed to know what was going on. "I've been investigating this case for a long time," Rhodes continued, his voice low but firm, "and what I found doesn't match the story that's been presented in this courtroom. Not even close." Lily's mind spun. Was this it? Was this the moment everything would finally come into focus? Could Detective Rhodes be the one to bring the final piece of the puzzle to light? "The defendant you all think is guilty," Rhodes went on. "He's not the one you should be focusing on. I've gathered new evidence. Evidence that links someone else entirely to the crime. Someone who has been pulling the strings from the shadows." A murmur swept through the courtroom as people processed his words. Lily's breath caught in her throat. This was bigger than she had imagined. The stakes were higher than ever. Was it possible that they had been chasing the wrong person all along? Judge Thompson, who had been following the detective's every word with growing curiosity, raised an eyebrow. "And who exactly are you suggesting is behind this?" he asked, his voice now tinged with suspicion. Rhodes took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes never leaving the judge. The room was on edge, waiting for him to reveal the name that could shatter everything. "I'm suggesting that the man standing right here in front of you," Rhodes said, his voice echoing in the hushed room, "Mr. Harrison Carter, is the one behind it all." Lily's stomach dropped. The accusation was shocking, far beyond what she had expected. Harrison Carter, the very prosecutor who had been so eager to see the defendant convicted, was now being accused of being the mastermind. The courtroom erupted into chaos. People stood from their seats, gasping in disbelief. Some shouted accusations. Others questioned what they had just heard. But through it all, Harrison Carter remained unervingly silent, his face pale and unreadable. Judge Thompson, however, was quick to regain control. He slammed his gavel down, demanding order. "Enough!" the judge bellowed. "Detective Rhodes, you will explain yourself, or I will have you removed from this courtroom immediately." The detective didn't flinch. "I have the evidence," he said, pulling out a thick manila folder from beneath his coat. Evidence that shows Carter's involvement in the manipulation of the case. Evidence that proves he's been orchestrating the entire situation from the beginning. Lily's mind was racing. Could this be true? Had Carter been working against the truth all this time? She thought of all the times she had questioned his methods, his aggressive tactics, his tendency to hide the truth. But to accuse him of something this severe seemed unbelievable. Yet, Rhodes was not finished. This is bigger than just one case, he continued. Carter has been using his position to manipulate several investigations, covering up his tracks and framing innocent people to protect his own interests. But it's all about to come crashing down. The room fell into a stunned silence as the weight of Rhodes' words settled over them. Carter's reputation, the very foundation of the case, was now in question. Was everything he had presented a lie? Were they all part of a much larger scheme? Carter's face twisted into a scowl. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice barely audible but full of venom. "You can't do this. This is all fabricated." "Is it?" Rhodes asked, his voice hardening. "Then I guess you won't mind if I show the court the evidence that proves you're lying." With a swift motion, Rhodes opened the folder and handed it to the judge. The courtroom watched in hushed anticipation as Judge Thompson scanned the documents. His brow furrowed as he read through the evidence. The detective's words echoed in Lily's mind. It's all about to come crashing down. But just as the judge began to make sense of the evidence, something unexpected happened. The doors to the courtroom burst open once more, and another person stepped inside. This time it wasn't just one person. It was a group of people who, like the others, were not expected. The doors to the courtroom flew open once again, this time with such force that they slammed against the walls. A new group of people entered, their presence commanding the room yet carrying an air of mystery and danger. The faces of those who had already been in the room went from disbelief to outright confusion as the newcomers walked in, their footsteps heavy yet deliberate. The first to step forward was a tall man with slicked-back hair wearing an expensive suit that gleamed under the courtroom's harsh lights. His expression was cold, almost too perfect, as if he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times before. Behind him, another woman entered, her demeanor just as confident as the man's. She had an aura of authority, but there was something in her eyes, a coldness that didn't match her polished appearance. Lily's heart raced. Who were these people? Why had they appeared just as everything was coming to a head? She had already seen so many surprises today, but this was something else entirely. Detective Rhodes, still standing near the judge's bench, seemed to notice the shift in the atmosphere. His hand instinctively moved toward the gun on his hip, but he didn't draw it yet. There was something about these newcomers that unsettled him, and Lily could see it in his eyes. Judge Thompson, his face set in a hard expression, cleared his throat, signaling for the room to settle. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice demanding an answer. The tall man in the suit smiled, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. "You may call me Vincent Hawke," he said smoothly, his voice low and commanding. "And this is my associate, Miss Morgan Steele." Lily's stomach twisted. Vincent Hawke, the name was unfamiliar to her, but there was something about the way he said it, something that made her nervous. It wasn't just the calm confidence with which he spoke. It was the way he carried himself, as if he were untouchable, as if the law didn't apply to him. "We have," Hawke continued, his gaze flickering toward the defendant's family sitting quietly in the back of the room, a very vested interest in the outcome of this case. He spoke each word slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone was paying attention. "And I believe it's time for us to intervene." Lily glanced over at Detective Rhodes, who looked even more tense than before. It seemed like these newcomers weren't here by accident. They had a plan, and whatever that plan was, It couldn't be good for anyone who was trying to seek justice today. Judge Thompson raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled by their sudden appearance. "And why exactly would you be intervening, Mr. Hawk?" Hawk stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the judge. "Because, Your Honor, the defendant's fate is tied to a much larger web than you realize." He paused, letting his words sink in, the weight of them hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Lily could feel her pulse racing. Who were these people? How were they connected to the case? She had thought she knew the truth, but now it seemed like the ground beneath her feet was constantly shifting. "I'm afraid," Hawk continued, "that the truth you've been searching for is not as simple as you might have hoped. There are far more powerful forces at play here than any of you realize." Lily's mind was reeling. Powerful forces? What was he talking about? She felt a growing sense of unease wash over her, as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff and all she could do was watch as it crumbled beneath her. "I'm sure you've heard of certain interests in this case," Hawk went on, his voice smooth, his eyes glinting. "Interests that span far beyond this courtroom." At that moment, the woman named Morgan Steele stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She had been silent until now, but when she spoke, her voice was just as sharp and commanding as Hawk's. "You're wasting your time here," Steele said, her words cutting through the room like a knife. "The people involved in this case are far more dangerous than you could possibly imagine. And no matter what you think you know, you've only scratched the surface." Lily felt a chill run down her spine. Dangerous? Was this about to get even worse? The words felt like a warning she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Detective Rhodes took a step forward, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked, his voice cold but filled with uncertainty. Hawk's smile remained, but it was no longer reassuring. "Let's just say," he said slowly, his eyes narrowing, "that you don't know who you're up against. You've been chasing shadows, detective, and now those shadows are coming for you." Lily's head spun as she tried to process everything that was happening. Who were these people? What did they mean by powerful forces? What did they have to do with the case, and most importantly, why were they all so calm, as if they knew something that no one else did? Before anyone could respond, Judge Thompson, still reeling from the weight of Hawk's words, slammed his gavel down with force that silenced the room. "Enough!" the judge bellowed. "If you have something to say, Mr. Hawk, you will say it now. Otherwise, I'll have you removed from this courtroom." For the first time, Hawk's expression shifted, just slightly. The cold facade he had maintained cracked, revealing something colder, more dangerous beneath. "Very well," Hawk said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You want to know the truth? Fine. But be careful what you ask for." He turned toward the judge, the room holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. "We've been in control of this case from the very beginning," Hawk said, his words now laced with a chilling certainty. "Everything you've been told, everything you've seen, it's been orchestrated. The defendant, the prosecutor, even the so-called evidence, it's all part of a much larger scheme." The room fell into an eerie silence as those words hung in the air like poison. Lily's heart raced as she struggled to comprehend what Hawk was saying. Was he admitting to manipulating the case? Was he saying they had been in control of the entire investigation? And if so, why? The courtroom remained silent for what felt like an eternity, Lily's mind whirling, trying to make sense of what Vincent Hawk had just said. In control from the very beginning? She looked around at the stunned faces of everyone in the room. The judge, the prosecutor, even Detective Rhodes. It was clear they were all just as confused as she was. Hawk's words echoed in Lily's mind like a steady drumbeat, growing louder with each passing second. He had said the case was orchestrated, that everything they thought they knew was a lie. her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had been so sure of her fight for justice, so certain that she had uncovered the truth. But now it felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Judge Thompson's expression softened, just a little. It wasn't the cold, unyielding gaze that had struck fear into so many. Instead, there was a flicker of something else. Confusion, uncertainty, perhaps even doubt. I don't understand, the judge muttered, his voice strained. What are you suggesting, Mr. Hawk? Hawk didn't smile, he didn't need to. His confidence was overwhelming enough. I'm suggesting that everything you think is happening right now, the defendant, the evidence, the testimony, it's all been manipulated to lead you to a predetermined conclusion. His voice dropped, lowering with each word. And if you don't stop playing into the hands of those pulling the strings, it will be too late. Lily could hardly breathe. The weight of his words felt like a heavy fog filling her lungs. Predetermined conclusion? She couldn't wrap her mind around it. Her eyes flicked to the defendant, still sitting quietly in the back of the room. Was he really innocent, or had they all been deceived? Detective Rhodes took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Hawk, his expression serious but with a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. Are you saying you've been pulling the strings this whole time? He demanded. Hawk didn't flinch. He simply gave a single, slow nod. Not just me, he said coolly, but I'm part of the system, detective. And you've been chasing a ghost, believing in a fairy tale while all along. The people responsible for this crime have been operating under your noses. Lily's heart pounded in her chest. The detective, her father's old partner, someone she had trusted, was caught in the same web of deceit just like everyone else. How deep did this go? And who exactly was pulling the strings? You can't be serious, Rhodes said, his voice tight with disbelief. You expect me to believe that this entire investigation has been a setup? That we've all been part of some grand scheme? Hawk's eyes darkened. I don't expect you to believe me right now, he said coldly, but you will eventually. Lily looked at Rhodes, his jaw clenched, his fists balled at his sides. He seemed shaken, as if this revelation had struck him harder than it should have. But then, to Lily's surprise, the detective didn't respond. Instead, he turned toward the judge, his eyes searching for answers. Your Honor, Rhodes began, his voice steadying, we need to know everything now. If what Mr. Hawk is saying is true, we have to know what we're up against. Judge Thompson paused for a long moment, the gavel still resting in his hand. The room was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. The truth was hanging in the balance, and no one knew which direction it would tip. The judge exhaled sharply, then nodded. Very well, Mr. Hawk. If you're suggesting that this case has been manipulated, then I expect you to provide something concrete, something that proves your claims. Hawk smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone who had just won a victory. It was the smile of someone who knew he was about to reveal something far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. I've already given you enough, Hawk said, his voice low and calm. But I can do more. If you really want to know what's been happening behind the scenes, I suggest you take a closer look at who's been financing this entire trial. Lily's breath caught in her throat. Financing? She didn't understand. Who could possibly be funding all of this? Why would anyone invest in such a complex and dangerous game? Hawk continued, his words deliberate. Follow the money. That's all you need to do. Find out who's been paying for the so-called evidence that's been presented in this court. Find out who has been pushing the narrative you've all been following, and you'll have your answers. A chill ran down Lily's spine. She had no idea what that meant, but something told her it was bigger than just one case. This was part of a larger plan, one that stretched far beyond the courtroom. But who was behind it? Judge Thompson, still processing the weight of Hawk's words, turned to his staff, signaling for them to gather information. He needed answers, and quickly. The room buzzed with murmurs as everyone began to move, eager to uncover the truth. Lily couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency build inside her. Time was running out. Whatever was happening, whatever Hawk and his associates had planned, it was coming to a head. The truth was within reach, but only if they could navigate the web of lies that had been carefully spun around them. Just as the judge prepared to take action, the doors to the courtroom opened yet again. This time, a familiar face stepped inside. It was her mother. Lily's heart skipped a beat as she saw her. After all these years, she never thought she would see her mother again. She was the last person Lily expected to walk through that door. And yet there she was, standing in the doorway, looking at Lily with a mix of regret and sorrow in her eyes. "Mom," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence, the moment hanging in the balance as Lily tried to understand why her mother was here and what she knew about all of this. The moment Lily's mother stepped into the room, her figure, tall and slender, stood in the doorway like a ghost from Lily's past. The sharp lines of her face, the once familiar expression of warmth, were now clouded with something darker, something Lily couldn't quite place. For a moment, Lily stood frozen, unable to process the shock of seeing her mother. She hadn't seen her in years, not since the day her mother had disappeared without a word, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a hollow ache in Lily's heart. Her mother's departure had been shrouded in mystery, and no one, not even Detective Rhodes, who had once been her father's partner, had ever been able to uncover the truth behind it. But now, here she was, standing in the same courtroom that had just witnessed one of the most explosive confrontations in recent memory. Lily's breath caught in her throat. What was her mother doing here? Why had she come back now, of all times? The judge, still trying to process everything that had happened in the last few moments, narrowed his eyes at the newcomer. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp with authority. Her mother stood tall, her gaze meeting Lily for a brief second before she turned her attention to Judge Thompson. "I'm Emma Collins," she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with an underlying tension. Lily's mother. The room seemed to exhale collectively, as if no one had been prepared for this revelation. Emma Collins was a name that had been lost to time, a name that most people thought had been erased from history. Lily's heart raced as the weight of the moment sank in. Her mother, she was here, and she hadn't been part of the story for so long that her sudden return felt like a lightning strike to the heart. "Your Honor, I'm sorry for the interruption," Emma continued, her eyes flickering briefly to Lily, "but I've come here to clarify something that I believe will change everything." Lily's mind spun. What was her mother talking about? Why had she chosen this moment to come forward? And why hadn't she contacted Lily sooner if she had known what was going on? The judge, clearly unsettled by the unexpected appearance, motioned for her to continue. "You have the floor," he said, though his voice was filled with caution. Emma took a deep breath, then began. "I'm sure many of you have questions about why I left," she said, her voice a bit quieter now, "but I didn't leave by choice. I was forced to disappear. I was—" She hesitated for a moment, her eyes darkening. "I was threatened, and in order to protect Lily, I had to leave without a trace." The courtroom was utterly still, everyone hanging on her every word. Lily's heart raced as she tried to absorb the magnitude of what her mother had just said. Threatened? What could possibly have been so dangerous that her mother had to leave, abandoning everything, including her daughter? "I'm sorry, but this doesn't make sense," Detective Rhodes said, his voice hard with confusion and suspicion. "If you were threatened, why didn't you reach out for help? Why didn't you contact anyone? You could have gone to the authorities." Emma shook her head slowly. It wasn't that simple. You don't understand the kind of people we're dealing with. They have eyes everywhere. They know things about you, things you don't even know about yourself. Her voice faltered for a moment, and Lily could see the fear behind the mask of confidence. Who are they? Lily asked, her voice trembling as she stood up. Who are you talking about, and why didn't you tell me any of this before? Emma glanced at her daughter, her expression softening for just a moment before she steeled herself again. I couldn't, Lily. Couldn't risk it. You weren't safe. None of us were. I thought the best thing I could do was disappear and leave you out of this. Lily felt as if the room was spinning. Her mother, her real mother, had known something, had been part of something that had been kept from Lily all this time. And now, after all these years, she had returned just as the case was coming to a head. Was it possible that her disappearance, the sudden end to her relationship with Lily, was all connected to the conspiracy that had unfolded in the courtroom? Judge Thompson, still processing Emma's words, leaned forward. What do you mean by they, Miss Collins? Who is behind this? His voice had lost some of its usual authority, replaced with genuine curiosity. Whatever Emma was about to say, it was clear that even the judge was beginning to doubt the reality of everything that had come before them. Emma's face hardened again. I can't give you all the details, she said, her voice low and almost reluctant, but I will tell you this. The people behind this case, the ones who've been manipulating the outcome, are far more dangerous than anyone realizes. They control everything, every piece of evidence, every investigation, every person who's ever been involved. Lily felt a chill crawl up her spine. The people behind this case. Who were they? How was her mother involved in something so far-reaching? Emma's gaze met Lily's, and for the first time since she had reappeared, Lily saw the raw emotion in her mother's eyes. You need to understand, Lily. Everything I did, leaving, disappearing, it was for your safety. I didn't want you to be caught up in this. But now it's clear that this is much bigger than I ever imagined. Lily's thoughts were racing. It was all starting to make sense in a way, but she couldn't piece everything together. If her mother had been involved in something this dangerous, who else had known, and why had she waited until now to return? Before she could ask another question, Hawk, who had been silently observing the exchange, stepped forward again. This changes everything, he said, his voice colder than before. The pieces are finally falling into place. It's no longer just about this case or the defendant. This is about something far more significant. Lily's stomach churned. What did he mean? She demanded. What are you saying? Hawk's eyes flicked toward Emma, then back to the judge. I've known Miss Collins for a long time, he said, his voice smooth but carrying an ominous undertone. And I can tell you that she's not the only one who's been keeping secrets. We're all part of something much bigger than a courtroom battle. Lily felt her breath catch in her throat. What her mother's disappearance, Detective Rhodes's involvement, and now Hawk's cryptic words. What was going on? What was the truth? And just as she thought the storm of revelations would come to an end, another unexpected figure entered the courtroom. The doors to the courtroom opened once again, this time with such force that the heavy wood slammed against the walls. Everyone turned, the tension in the air palpable as a tall, stern man stepped inside. His dark suit and cold, calculating eyes made him appear like someone who had just walked out of a nightmare. This man, like all the others who had appeared today, did not belong here. He was out of place, but his presence was undeniable. Lily's heart skipped a beat as she saw the man. His face was unfamiliar to her, but the aura he carried, an almost suffocating presence, struck her immediately. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, someone who was always one step ahead of everyone else. Without speaking a word, the man walked forward, his gaze briefly flicking over to Emma and then to Lily. He didn't stop to greet anyone. He simply moved with an air of inevitability, as though he knew exactly where he was meant to be. "Who is this?" Judge Thompson demanded, his voice a little more forceful than usual. The atmosphere had become increasingly volatile, and no one knew what to expect next. The man stopped just before the bench, his eyes never leaving the judge. "I'm Agent Nathaniel Cross," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "And I'm here because I believe you've all been chasing the wrong people." The room fell into complete silence. The words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Chasing the wrong people. Lily's thoughts scrambled as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Another new player in a game she didn't fully understand. Another person with the power to change everything. "Agent Cross," Judge Thompson said slowly, the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "And what exactly is your business here?" Cross didn't hesitate. "I'm with a task force that's been investigating a larger operation, an operation that you've been unknowingly involved in. You've been caught in the middle of something far bigger than this case. And I'm here to ensure you don't make a mistake that could cost everyone." Lily's breath caught in her throat. A task force? Her mind raced. How many people were involved in this? Who were they? And why was she, of all people, caught in the middle of this? "Wait a minute," Rhodes interjected, his voice laced with disbelief. "You're saying this whole case has been part of some larger operation? That we've been, what, manipulated into playing a role?" Cross's eyes narrowed, the faintest flicker of impatience passing over his face. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. This case was never about the defendant. It's been about distracting you, throwing you off course while those responsible for the real crimes continue operating in the shadows." Lily's pulse quickened as Cross's words hit her like a hammer. Shadows? What was he talking about? She thought she had seen the full scope of the conspiracy, but now it seemed like everything had been just one layer of a much deeper mystery. Judge Thompson frowned. "This is preposterous. If there's a larger operation at play here, why are you just now telling us? And why didn't you step in earlier?" Cross met the judge's gaze with unwavering certainty. "Because you weren't meant to know. Everything has been carefully controlled, and this case was just another piece of the puzzle. But now that it's getting too close to the truth, we need to step in. You've all been investigating the wrong person. The real criminals have been hiding in plain sight, using this case to cover their tracks." Lily could hardly believe what she was hearing. The wrong person? The entire investigation had been a distraction? Who was behind this? What was the endgame? Her mother, Emma, stepped forward, her face pale and drawn. She had been watching the scene unfold, but now she moved closer to Lily, her voice shaky as if she were still processing the shock of seeing her husband alive. "Agent Cross," she began, her voice trembling. "What do you mean? Who are the real criminals?" Cross glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "The people you've been trying to protect yourselves from," he said. "Those are the ones behind it all. The ones who've been manipulating the system from within." Lily felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to click into place. The system, her mother's disappearance, the strange way her father's case had gone cold, the manipulations of the prosecutor, and now this, an entirely new layer to the conspiracy that had been hiding beneath the surface. But who were these people, and why were they so determined to stay hidden? The tension in the room was unbearable. Everyone was waiting for Cross to elaborate, but he remained silent for a moment, as if weighing the importance of what he was about to say next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "I can't give you everything right now," Cross said, his voice grim, "but what I can tell you is this. The truth is far more dangerous than any of you realize. If you keep digging into this case, you're only going to expose yourselves to greater danger. and I'm not sure the law can protect you from what's coming next. Lily's heart pounded in her chest. What's coming next? She couldn't understand what Cross meant. Was he warning them, or was he telling them to back off before it was too late? Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of running footsteps. The doors to the courtroom burst open once again, but this time it wasn't just one or two people. It was a group rushing in with a sense of urgency that made everyone freeze. Lily's eyes widened as the group entered, and for the first time in a long while, she felt genuine fear. The leader of the group stepped forward, his face obscured by a mask, and as he pulled it off, Lily recognized him instantly. It was someone she had known all too well. It was her father. Lily's heart skipped a beat. There, standing in the doorway with his signature calm yet intense gaze, was her father. For a moment, the room was completely still, as if time itself had frozen in place. Her father, someone she had believed to be gone, perhaps forever, was standing before her, and with him, a group of people she didn't recognize, all wearing the same dark, almost ominous expressions. Lily could hardly believe her eyes. It's him, she thought, her pulse racing. It's really him. Her father, Samuel Collins, had vanished years ago, leaving Lily with nothing but unanswered questions. Everyone, including the police, had believed that he had been taken by the same dangerous forces that had forced her mother to disappear. But now, here he was, alive, standing in front of her in the same courtroom that had become the epicenter of a massive conspiracy. "Dad," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. She couldn't contain the emotion that surged through her. She took a hesitant step toward him, her hand reaching out as though she was afraid he might vanish if she didn't touch him. "Is it really you?" For a moment, her father's face remained unreadable. Then slowly, a small, weary smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "It's me, Lily," he said, his voice rough with years of silence. "I never meant to leave you like that." Tears welled up in Lily's eyes. She had thought he was lost to her forever, thought she would never see him again, and now here he was, but not in the way she had imagined. He was surrounded by people who clearly had something to do with all the chaos that had unfolded. Lily took another step forward, her voice barely a whisper. "What's happening, Dad? What's going on? Why didn't you tell me you were alive? Why did you leave me?" Her father's eyes softened as he looked at her, but there was also an unmistakable sadness in them. "Lily, I'm so sorry for everything. I had to disappear. I was trying to protect you, all of you," he said, his voice strained. "The people behind everything, the ones who've been manipulating this case, controlling the evidence, pulling the strings, they've been after us for years." Lily felt her knees go weak, and she steadied herself by gripping the back of a chair near her. The people behind the case? It was as if every part of her life had been thrown into chaos in the last few hours. But now, with her father standing before her, everything seemed to crash together in a moment of shocking clarity. Her father continued, his voice low but filled with urgency. "I had to go underground, Lily. I had to make sure they didn't find me or you. They've been watching, always watching. If I had stayed, I would have put you in danger. I thought I could keep you safe by keeping my distance. But now I see it was a mistake." Lily's mind was spinning. The room, already full of tension, suddenly felt like it was closing in on her. The people behind everything, the ones who've been pulling the strings. She thought back to everything she had uncovered. The prosecutor, the mysterious task force, the web of lies that seemed to entangle everyone. Was her father's disappearance connected to this larger conspiracy? Her mother, Emma, stepped forward now, her face pale and drawn. She had been watching the scene unfold but now moved closer to Lily. Her voice was shaky, as if she were still processing the shock of seeing her husband alive. "Sam, is this really happening?" Are you telling us the truth? What's going on? Lily's father nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Lily. It's the truth. I've been trying to track them down for years, but they're too powerful. I've only just begun to unravel the full extent of their operation, but I know this much. This case is just the beginning. The defendant you've all been focusing on, he's a pawn, a distraction. His gaze flicked over to the judge and the rest of the courtroom. They've been manipulating all of you. The room was silent again, the weight of his words sinking in like lead. A pawn? Lily's thoughts raced. The case had never been about the defendant at all. It was about something bigger, something her father had been chasing all this time, something that had taken him away from her, from everything. Who are they? Lily finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Who are these people, Dad? Why are they doing this? Her father's face darkened. I can't give you all the answers yet, but I'll tell you what I know. They're not just criminals. They're an organization, a network of people who have infiltrated the highest levels of power. Politics, law enforcement, even the courts. They control everything, and they've been using cases like this to hide their tracks, to keep their operations running smoothly. Lily felt a chill run through her. An organization, a network of criminals who controlled everything? It was like something out of a thriller, a nightmare that no one would believe, except that it was happening right in front of her eyes. And the people behind it, her father continued, his voice grim. They'll stop at nothing to keep their secret safe. That's why I had to disappear. They don't want anyone to know about them, and they'll kill anyone who gets in their way. Lily's breath caught in her throat. Kill anyone? Her mind raced, but there was no denying the seriousness in her father's eyes. This wasn't some wild conspiracy. This was real. But how do we stop them? Lily asked, her voice shaking with both fear and determination. How do we fight back? Her father's gaze softened as he looked at her. We start by finding the truth. We need to expose them, and we need to do it quickly before they can cover their tracks again. It won't be easy, but with the right people on our side, we can bring them down. Lily felt a surge of determination rise within her. She had been searching for the truth for so long, and now with her father back, the stakes had never been higher. She wasn't going to let these people continue to hide in the shadows. She was going to fight for the truth no matter what it took. But just as she steeled herself for what came next, the courtroom doors burst open once again. Another figure walked in, a figure that would change everything once more. The doors to the courtroom slammed open once again, and this time it wasn't just a figure who entered. It was an entire group of people, more than 10, all in dark suits and with the same intense, purpose-driven energy. They moved as a unit, eyes focused forward, the weight of their presence turning the already charged atmosphere even more suffocating. Lily's stomach dropped. She didn't recognize any of them, but the way they carried themselves made it clear they weren't just bystanders. They were a part of something bigger, and just like the others, they had come to this place for a reason. Her father, Samuel, stiffened beside her, his jaw tightening as his eyes scanned the newcomers. He knew them, or at least he recognized the type of people they were. His hands subtly moved toward his pocket as if he were preparing for a confrontation, though he remained outwardly calm. The group's leader, a man with sharp, calculating eyes and a stone-cold expression, stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the room. His presence was commanding enough. This charade has gone on long enough, the man said, his voice smooth but laced with authority. Lily felt a cold shiver run through her. The way he spoke, so sure of himself, sent a message that couldn't be ignored. He was someone powerful, someone who had been behind this all along. You're wasting your time, all of you, the man continued, his voice steady. You think you're chasing after something noble, but you have no idea what you're up against. You've all been pieces in a much larger game, one that doesn't involve your petty justice or your blind ideals. Lily's breath caught. Petty justice? He was talking to them like they were nothing, but she wasn't going to let him intimidate her. Not now. Not after everything she had already uncovered. She stood straighter, her gaze never leaving the man. Her father, however, was quicker to respond. "You're part of it, aren't you?" he said, his voice low but filled with cold certainty. "The ones pulling the strings, the ones behind the manipulations, the lies, and everything that's been happening." The man smiled, a slow, calculated grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Very perceptive," he said. "You're correct. I'm part of the organization. We're the ones who've been controlling the narrative, and now that you're all getting too close to the truth, it's time for you to stop digging." Lily felt a rising anger burn within her. "You're the ones who have been hiding the truth all this time, aren't you?" she said, her voice firm. "You're the ones who've been using people like my father, using all of us to cover up your crimes. But you won't get away with it." The man's eyes flashed with something. Amusement, maybe, or just the satisfaction of knowing he had the upper hand. "You don't understand. You never will. This isn't just about you, about your petty little investigation. This is about power, control, and the future of this country. And you, Lily Collins, are nothing more than a small obstacle in our path." Her heart raced as she realized how deep this ran. The future of the country? This wasn't just a criminal organization. This was a far-reaching, influential entity that had its claws in nearly every part of society. It was terrifying to think about how they had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, hiding in plain sight. The man's voice cut through her thoughts. "You've all been misled. The case you've been focusing on, the defendant you've been so eager to free, it's all a distraction, a means to an end. You've been chasing after shadows while we've been planning the next phase of our operation." Lily felt the ground beneath her shake. The case had never been about the defendant at all. It had been a cover, a way to keep them busy while something much bigger was happening in the background. "And now, Lily Collins, your father, your little fight for justice," the man continued, his gaze turning colder. "It's all coming to an end. You're out of time." Her father's hand tightened into a fist, his expression hardening. "You think you can stop us?" he growled. "You're wrong. We're not backing down. You've made one mistake after another, and it's time for the truth to come out." The leader of the group, the man who seemed to be orchestrating everything, tilted his head slightly, studying Samuel. "I admire your determination," he said, almost mockingly, "but it's too late. You should have stayed in hiding where you belonged. Now you've dragged your daughter into this mess, and we'll deal with her the same way we've dealt with the rest of you." Lily's stomach churned at the threat, but there was no way she was going to back down now. "You don't scare me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. "We know what you're doing, and we won't stop until everyone knows the truth." The man's smile faded, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes. "Very well," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "If you insist on continuing this, we'll simply have to show you how far you're willing to go." Lily knew what that meant. She knew they were done playing games. This wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about survival. They were facing people who would stop at nothing to protect their power. And if they weren't careful, Lily, her father, and everyone else who was involved in uncovering the truth might not make it out alive. Just then, one of the group members stepped forward, a woman with dark, calculating eyes. "We're not here to debate anymore," she said, her voice cool and measured. "We've done all we needed to do, and now it's time for you all to make a choice." Lily looked between her father and the group, her mind racing. She had always been a fighter, but this felt like a battle they might not win. And yet, as she looked at her father standing beside her, finally back after all these years, she knew one thing. She wasn't going to give up, not now. And just when Lily thought things couldn't get worse, the unthinkable happened. The courtroom doors burst open again. But this time, the arrival was something she didn't expect. Her mother stepped inside. Lily's heart stopped as the doors to the courtroom opened one last time. The room was already on edge, the air thick with tension from everything that had just transpired. But when her mother walked in calm, collected, and with a resolve that seemed to shake the very foundation of the space, it felt as though the ground beneath them had just shifted yet again. Emma Collins, Lily's mother, who had disappeared without a trace all those years ago, was standing in the doorway, her sharp, calculated gaze sweeping across the room. Her expression was unreadable, but Lily could see something in her eyes that sent a chill down her spine. It was the same cold determination she had seen in the faces of those who were behind the conspiracy. "Mom," Lily whispered, her voice breaking as she stepped forward. "What are you doing here?" Emma's eyes flickered to Lily, her face softening for a moment before she turned her attention back to the group. "I'm here to end this," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived through much more than they had let on. The room fell silent once more, the air so heavy it felt impossible to breathe. The group of people who had been so threatening just moments before seemed to pause, their faces now showing a flicker of confusion. Emma's presence had disrupted everything, and no one seemed to know how to act. Lily's father, Samuel, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Emma. "You're here now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything, you finally show up?" Emma gave him a quick glance but didn't respond immediately. Instead, her eyes focused on the leader of the shadowy group who had been pulling the strings. She didn't seem intimidated by him or any of the others in the room. She stood tall, her body language firm and resolute. "You," she said, her voice steady but filled with an underlying tension, "are part of the problem. You've been manipulating everything, destroying lives, deceiving everyone, and you've been doing it with impunity. But not anymore." The leader of the group, who had been so confident just moments ago, seemed to falter. His cool demeanor slipped slightly as he faced Emma. "You're brave to show yourself now, Miss Collins," he said, his voice dangerously smooth, "but you should have stayed in hiding. You don't know what you're up against." Emma didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes burned with a fire that Lily had never seen before. "I've known what I'm up against for years," she replied. "That's why I had to leave, to protect my daughter, to protect all of us. But I didn't disappear because I was scared. I disappeared because I had a plan, and now it's time to finish it." The man's eyes darkened. "You think you can stop us? You think you can stop me?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. He stepped forward, his gaze locking with Emma's. "You have no idea what we've been building. You've spent all these years in hiding, and now you think you can come in and undo everything we've done." Emma's expression hardened, and she didn't move an inch. "You've underestimated me," she said quietly, "and you've underestimated everyone who stood by me. The truth is coming out. You've run this game for too long, and it ends today." Lily's head was spinning. She had spent so long searching for the truth, piecing together the secrets her parents had hidden from her. And now here they were, both of them standing before her, defying the people who had controlled every part of their lives. Emma, her mother, had not only survived this, she had been playing her own part in the bigger picture the entire time. "You're a fool if you think you can just walk in here and stop us," the man snarled, his voice low and venomous. "Everything you've done, everything you thought you knew, it's meaningless. You're nothing but an inconvenience now." For a split second, Lily saw a flicker of something different in her mother's eyes. Something that wasn't just fierce determination but pure, cold fury. Emma stepped forward, closing the space between herself and the leader. "The only thing that's meaningless is your power," she said. "It's fragile, and now it's crumbling." The leader took a step back, his gaze now shifting between Emma, Samuel, and Lily. "You don't know what you're dealing with. You're all playing a game you can't possibly win. You think you can expose us? You think the truth will set you free?" Emma didn't hesitate. "The truth always comes to light," she said, "and the people who try to bury it, they end up paying the price." The man's eyes flicked to the rest of his group, who had been watching in silence. It was as if they were waiting for his orders, waiting for him to decide what would happen next. But the moment dragged on, the uncertainty in the room growing thicker by the second. The man was starting to realize something. Emma Collins wasn't as powerless as they had thought, and neither was Lily. "You may have won this round," the leader said finally, his voice still venomous but with a hint of retreat. "But this isn't over. You have no idea what's coming next. You think you've exposed the truth? You think you can take us down? You're wrong." Emma met his eyes without a single trace of fear. "We'll see about that," she said coldly. "This ends now." The man turned toward his group, his jaw clenched in frustration before he gave them a signal. With that, they began to move toward the door, a few members glancing back at Emma with expressions of anger while others seemed more wary. But just as they were about to leave, the doors of the courtroom suddenly slammed shut with an alarming force. Lily's heart skipped a beat as a new, unfamiliar figure entered the room. The door clicked shut behind them, and as the figure stepped into view, everyone in the courtroom froze. It was an official, someone with authority, someone who had been silently observing everything from the sidelines, and now it was clear they were here to make a move of their own. The figure who stepped into the courtroom was tall, dressed in a sharp black suit, and carried an air of undeniable authority. His eyes were sharp, scanning the room with precision, but there was something more unsettling about him. He wasn't just a lawyer, nor a member of law enforcement. This man was someone who had the power to change everything with just a single word. Lily's heart raced in her chest. "Who is this?" she thought. "What is he here for?" He moved toward the front of the room, his footsteps echoing through the silence. The door behind him had shut with a finality that seemed to seal the fate of everyone present. The mysterious group who had been so close to leaving now turned to face him, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and calculation, their eyes darting back and forth. The man didn't waste time. He spoke with a voice that commanded attention, yet was calm and measured. "I suggest we all take a seat," he said, his words sharp but polite. "What has transpired here today is a matter of great importance, and it's time for everyone to understand the truth. The full truth." Lily, her mind still spinning from everything that had unfolded in the last few hours, stepped back, unsure of what to expect. Her father and mother both seemed to recognize the seriousness in the man's presence. Emma, despite her calm exterior, looked almost as shocked as Lily. "Who are you?" Emma asked, her voice steady but with a note of weariness. The man's eyes flicked to Emma, a small, unreadable smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "My name is Alan Dew," he said simply, "and I've been watching this case unfold for a long time." "Watching?" Samuel Collins repeated, his voice heavy with suspicion. "You've been watching, and just now you decide to step in?" Dew nodded. "I've been monitoring certain events, waiting for the right moment, and now that moment is here." Lily's mind raced. "What does that mean?" The figure stepped fully into the room, and finally addressed everyone present, his gaze moving between the gathered members, Lily's family, the mysterious figures from the organization, and the stunned courtroom onlookers. You've all been pawns in a much larger game, Du continued, his voice unwavering. But it's time for the final pieces to fall into place. You see, this case, it was never about the defendant or the prosecutor or even the supposed corruption. It's always been about something far more significant. Lily's stomach twisted. Her father, her mother, and she had been caught in the midst of it all, unraveling a web that, as it turned out, was only a small part of a much larger picture. She suddenly felt small, insignificant in the grand scheme of everything. How could they fight against something so vast, so entrenched? Who's behind all of this? Lily asked, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. What do you want from us? Du finally looked directly at her. His eyes, dark and calculating, held her gaze for a long moment. Then he spoke with the chilling clarity that had started to settle over the room. What I want doesn't matter. It's not about me. It's about the system that's been controlling everything for generations. We've kept things under control by manipulating events like this one. The people you think are guilty, they were chosen to be guilty long before any of you even set foot in this courtroom. The word chosen hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The truth, Lily realized, was something she wasn't prepared to face. What Du was saying didn't just challenge the case. It shook the foundation of everything she had believed about justice, power, and truth. The truth is, Du continued, it's not about who wins or loses today. It's about who controls the narrative, and I'm afraid, Miss Collins. He turned to Lily with a slight smile. The truth you seek will be buried just like the rest. Lily's breath hitched. What does he mean? Was he saying they would never find the truth? Would everything they had fought for just vanish into the void, forgotten and irrelevant? Her father stepped forward, his fists clenched. You can't just walk in here and claim you control everything. He spat, his voice filled with venom. You don't own us. Du's smile widened, but it wasn't comforting. You're right. I don't own you, but I control the information, and that, Mr. Collins, is the only thing that matters. Control the information, control the world. The word stung like a slap. Lily wanted to scream, to demand that this man leave, but she knew deep down that it was futile. They were up against something far larger than they could have imagined. This wasn't just about her father's case or her mother's disappearance. This was about something darker, more insidious, something that reached beyond any of their individual struggles. As the weight of Du's words sank in, the people who had been trying to expose the truth, Lily, her parents, the detective, and the prosecutor, realized that they were just small players in a much bigger game. And for the first time, Lily understood what her father had meant when he said the system was broken. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. Was it over? Was there no hope for justice? Was this the end of everything they had fought for? But then something unexpected happened. In the midst of the tense silence, her mother, Emma, moved toward Du, her face set with a newfound determination. She didn't say a word. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded envelope. Not everything is in your control, Alan, Emma said quietly, her voice unwavering. She held the envelope up and handed it to him. This is just the beginning of the end for you. Du's face flickered with something. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe recognition. He took the envelope, his fingers brushing against Emma's. His smile faltered for the first time, as if something had shifted. Something had broken in the hold he thought he had on everyone. Lily's heart beat faster as she watched Du open the envelope, his eyes scanning the contents. The moment felt like it would stretch on forever, the weight of everything in the room pressing down on them all. And then, finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Du spoke. You think this will change anything? He asked, his voice cold but now tinged with uncertainty. You really believe you can undo everything? Emma's expression remained unchanged. We believe in the truth, and sometimes, Alan, the truth has a way of exposing itself no matter how deeply it's buried. For a moment, there was silence. The tension in the room was palpable, and Lily felt as though the walls were closing in around them. This was it, the moment of truth. Would everything they had uncovered be enough to take down the system they had been fighting against, or would it remain an unbreakable force controlling everything they did? As due slowly,